Welcome to Sickcast, brought to you by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Sickcast. I am Manvinder Kaur, and we're joined today by Santbir Singh, who is a research associate at the Sikh Research Institute. Santbir Singh is currently pursuing his PhD in sociology at York University. His research focuses on Sikh activism and the inherent relationship between Sikhi and anarchism, explored through historical and contemporary Sikh movements, such as the Kisan Morcha, or the Farmers' Protests, of 2020 to 2021. Hi, Santbir Singh. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi there, Manvinder. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. It's really great to be here. Thanks so much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion today.
Awesome. Me too. So folks know, today we'll be walking through Santbir Singh's article, No More Blue Stars, the whole of which can be found at sikhread.org. The article really delves into the various terms that have been used to describe the events of 1984. So we'll move through what these terms encompass, what they include, what they miss. Maybe if there's a term we think is able to do justice to the happenings of 1984, and then particularly doing this through a Sikh-centered lens. So in the piece, you write that growing up, the events of 1984 were mostly referred to as Operation Blue Star, which really centers the government narrative and perpetuates their specific narrative. When I similarly reflected in my experiences as like a member of the diaspora that was pretty much raised outside of the community, there wasn't really one name that we would use, but more reference to specific events. Mostly folks would be like 1984, or like the bombing of the Golden Temple. And I use that term on purpose to illustrate like how it was spoken about in my house in the community. And this really highlighted this one event, and it obstructed the before, the after, the why, who was involved, which I really saw as like a prime motivator behind a lot of like why this piece was written. So yeah, kind of in that vein, what motivated you to write this piece, and how did you start thinking about this topic and asking these questions?
So I've noticed over the last several years that the language around 1984 had been changing. And it was really interesting to see, and this is largely a diasporic phenomenon, as I say in my article. If we look at Punjab itself, in Punjab, the language used to describe both June and November 1984 has been pretty consistent. But in the diaspora, it's gone through many sort of iterations over time. And when I was younger, and I was born in 1981, so I've, sort of very faintly remember 1984, but more the aftermath. Um, in English, when we spoke about it or when we heard about it in the media, when we ourselves would talk about it at like candlelight vigils or protests, we would say Operation Blue Star. That was the language that we used. And using the government's language, the Indian Army's language, I think is inherently problematic because, of course, when you use their language, you're also using their framing. You're also using their logic in how they view the event and how they frame the event for people in India and around the world. And what I've seen over the last, especially 20 years, 24 years, since around the turn of the millennium, is that young Sikhs in the diaspora have been working to change the language with which they used to talk about 1984. And there's various different reasons for that that I go through in my article. But I think the primary sort of reason is a sort of a larger desire to build a personal connection with what happened in 1984, especially for those who were born after 84 or who barely remember 84. This is this seminal moment in Sikh history, this really important moment in Sikh history. But how do we talk about it? How does it affect us? How does the trauma reverberate through the generations? And how do we process that trauma? How do we talk about the different ideas that arise from it? And how do we talk about the different struggles that came along with it? And I think all of those different questions get encapsulated in the language we use for how we talk about the events. And that's what I found particularly interesting. So, this was really a topic that I've been thinking about for a while. And then when we came up with the idea of let's write some articles around 84 for Sikri for the 40th anniversary of 84, I thought of this idea immediately, and I thought, this is a great idea. Why don't I look at this in a little bit more depth? And when I started off the article, I was thinking about, looking at the change in language, but the article also became a little bit of a diatribe, maybe, where I was trying to say, maybe we should be going towards this specific goal as a community, because that's sort of naturally where it ended up in my mind is why don't we actually where I feel like we're going along a certain path, and why don't we continue along that path? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think at the beginning of the article, you speak about how this shift was really propelled by the diaspora. So I'm also wondering where like the Sikhs of Punjab fit into this, in this attempts to shift language. Yeah, can you locate them as well for us?
Yeah, for sure. So in Punjab, the way that 84 is talked about is that it's often talked about as the Kalukara, and it's talked about as Tija Kalukara or Chirasida Kalukara. So the third Kalukara or the Kalukara of 1984. And so that's how people have talked about it in Punjab. And that's the language that they use. When they write in English in Punjab, or when they write books or articles, then they will start using other terms. But when people are talking in Punjabi, in common parlance, in newspaper articles and stuff, the terms they use would be Kalukara. Whereas in the diaspora, um, sort of we've gone through these shifting different variations of language as time has passed. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm hearing a lot of like who the audience is matters. And of course, then language changes depending on the audience that folks are speaking to. Um, yeah, maybe we can, kind of move through the article together. You already shared a little bit about Operation Blue Star, what it misses, why there was an attempt to change the language. And then the article kind of moves from Operation Blue Star to talking about framing the events of 1984 as riots and then to pogroms. So although pogroms aren't a widely known term, often if folks do know the term, it's related to the events of the Holocaust. And you write that this shift maybe to pogroms was a conscious choice maybe by Sikh activists to link the experiences of what Sikhs endured in 1984 to the experiences of European Jews. Was this connection intentional? Was there actually a desire to link the two?
Yeah, let's talk about the word pogroms a little bit. So when we were younger, and now we're talking specifically about November 1984, when we would talk about November 1984, the language that was used and the language that we often would use in the diaspora as well would be riots. And we would say that these riots happened. And the problem with the word riots is very straightforward. It's a fact that riots are something that sort of happens spontaneously. Riots happen and they're not organized. And the events of November 84 were very systematically and horrifically organized. And there was a lot of thought put into how Sikhs were targeted around India and around Delhi. Voter lists were used, the names of businesses were created, lists of names of businesses were created, Sikh neighborhoods were targeted. It was a very systematic process. And so the word riots really had a lot of problems with it. And Sikh activists, I think, looking through the language, trying to come up with what would be a more appropriate English word that really quantified what happened in November 84, ended up choosing the word pogrom. And the word pogrom is an interesting one because even if you look at it in the dictionary, it says specifically that it is a sort of an organized campaign of violence, usually on the streets, against a certain ethnic or religious minority, but that it is specifically really tied to the experience of Eastern European Jews before and during the Holocaust, and especially in late 19th and 18th century Russia. And so, was the term pogroms used because it was specifically a good term that sort of really well described what we were trying to get across, that this was a systematic, organized massacre of civilians? Or was this also an attempt to demonstrate that we as Sikhs experienced something that was similar in magnitude or similar in horror to what the European Jews suffered in World War II? And I think there is an underlying desire, and there has been an underlying desire to sort of frame what we experienced in 1984 through the experience of what Jewish people experienced in the Holocaust. And I think that's because, as a cultural touch point, the Holocaust has become this overwhelming narrative. And almost all massive human rights abuses or horrors that have occurred since the Holocaust inevitably get compared to the Holocaust because of the scale of the killing that occurred during the Holocaust. And we have to understand that the Sikh diaspora, especially in the 80s and 90s, was really searching for some semblance of validation for our experience, some sort of recognition of our experience. And I think that the idea was, if we can link what we experienced with what Jewish people experienced in World War II, something that's widely acknowledged as a horrific event, then we can also be validated, that our experience also matters, that our experience also is relevant, that our experience also should be, respected and talked about, and we should not ignore what happened to Sikhs in 1984. And so I think it was somewhat, if not conscious, a subconscious choice to link what we experienced with what Jewish people experienced in the Holocaust. And I write about in the article that this can be a very problematic idea. And we see the problem with it with the ongoing war in Gaza that's happening right now, where often the Israeli state uses the Holocaust as cover for its human rights abuses and its ongoing genocide of Palestinians in Palestine. And the idea that every horrific event in human history has to be compared to the Holocaust is a pretty troubling one. And I don't think we need to quantify different human rights abuses, and we don't need to compare them against each other. We don't need to sort of judge whether one is as bad as another. Each one has its own unique sort of background, and the horrors are unique within them, unfortunately. And we don't need to always compare. And I think that was one issue with the word pogroms. But I also want to be very clear that I'm not criticizing the Sikh activists and scholars who started to use the word pogroms, because I think it was an attempt to say, let's move away from riots, let's use another word that's an English word, even though it comes from Russian or Yiddish perhaps, and let's use a word that can be used also in a legal setting. And I think that was one of the main reasons for the use of the word pogroms, was that it could be used in a legal setting to describe what happened to Sikhs in 1984, in November 1984. So I don't think it was necessarily a negative thing, but it is interesting because if you want to make our experience more easily understood by outsiders, then using a term that's not well known, like pogroms, kind of defeats the purpose, interestingly, you know? And we've always sort of been stuck in this, do we say riots? Do we say pogroms? And some people really don't like when we use the word pogroms. I've come across young Sikh activists who are like, I don't like using the word pogroms because people don't know what it means. And then we end up spending all our time explaining what the word pogrom means instead of actually talking about what happened in 1984. And so there are issues with the term, definitely. But I understand the logic and the reason why activists started to use it in the first place.
And that's kind of what I see as like the through line. Like these were the reasons why these terms were used when they were used. This is perhaps why they don't work now or anymore. And for like the purposes maybe that we want to use, well, for the purposes of why we want to create a definition. And I think this, like what you shared about the uniqueness of what happened in 1984, I feel like that through line is also evident throughout the article, and it kind of continues into the term genocide, which is what, in my experience, where the shift has occurred. Folks often refer to the events of 1984 as a genocide. In the circles that with the people that I speak to. And then, you also talk about why perhaps genocide, like the term genocide misses. So you write that genocide as a term, it takes agency away from those who experienced it, and then instead it depicts those people as perpetual victims. So I thought that distinction was really important and not one that I had thought about. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about what the term genocide misses, because I feel it is where we currently are in a lot of the conversations that I hear.
Yeah, and I think genocide is a really important term, and it's important when we come to the legal sort of struggle. And there's different Sikhs who are working on different avenues in terms of getting justice for 1984 or helping the community heal from 1984. And there are Sikhs who have committed themselves, people like the good people at Insaf, for example, or people like H.S. Fulka in India, who have really dedicated their lives to documenting the horrors of what happened and really trying in a legal discourse in the court systems to try to get justice for what happened in 84. And in those spaces, the word genocide is a really useful term because there's a legal definition of genocide that came out of the Nuremberg trials after World War II. And when you can demonstrate that what happened to Sikhs fits within that definition of genocide, that legal definition of genocide, then it gives power and it gives sort of validation to what Sikhs experienced. But the term genocide as a general marker of what happened in 84 really falls short in a lot of ways as well. So, I am being critical, but I also want to really again emphasize that I really do support the human rights workers and the lawyers who have been working and using this term. I'm not criticizing them. But when we talk about it amongst ourselves, the term genocide does fall short. And it's because when you're talking about a genocide, what you're talking about is here are victims and here are the perpetrators. And the people who are the victims are sort of always the term I use in the article is that they're inscribed as perpetual victims, that they're victims forever. And that's not really in keeping with the Sikh psyche or with the Sikh experience. And while the term genocide really works for November 1984, it doesn't work as clearly or as well for describing what happened in Amritsar and around Punjab in June of 1984. And the reason for that is because in June of 84 in Amritsar, Sikhs fought back against the Indian Army, and Sikhs organized and had a military campaign, a battle, where they tried to defend, or they did defend, the sovereignty and the sanctity of the Harmandir Sahib complex. And so when we think of the term genocide, we think of people who are sort of passive victims. And where does the story of these people who fought back, can that fall under the umbrella of the term genocide? It becomes pretty difficult for that to work, And you sort of see that the term genocide is sort of fraying at the edges. It's not really able to encompass the full Sikh experience, especially with what happened in June of 1984. So the term genocide is really useful in a lot of ways. Another point that I make in the article is that it was used, for example, in Ontario to get a genocide awareness week passed, which almost got passed but was shot down at the last minute by the current conservative government. And you know, in a legal space or in a political space like that, um, it would have been really powerful if the first week of November was by law in Ontario known as Sikh Genocide Awareness Week. That would mean that we could use educational resources from school districts to teach about what happened to Sikhs in 1984 and afterwards, and teach young people in Ontario what happened to Sikhs, and it would really help the community. So the term genocide is beneficial in a lot of ways, but it also falls short in many ways as well. And that's what I was trying to sort of describe, that nuance there in the term genocide.
Yeah, I think that was a really helpful distinction for me to make because I was like, yeah, I really had to think about what do I think the term genocide. Yeah, what does it encompass and what is there space for it to also still include? And then there's a shift from genocide to war where you talk about the Battle of Amritsar. Just for sake of time, if folks want to delve more into that, they can head to the article at sikri.org. But yeah, so you talk about a shift from genocide to war and then to Kalugara, which is a term that you have mentioned before in our conversation. But I'm wondering for folks who maybe haven't heard the term or don't know about it as well, could you just, yeah, maybe give us a little bit of background about what the term Kalugara is and what it means?
Yeah, so the term Kalukara is a really interesting word because it's a Sikh word. It's a word that Sikhs of the past came up with on their own. The etymology is not totally clear. It is an expression that the Sikhs who were living in the jungles of Punjab in the mid 18th century came up with to describe what was happening to them and what did happen to them in these large scale campaigns that were enacted by the Mughal and Afghani governments against them in the 18th century. And it specifically refers to two events that happened in Sikh history, the Shorta Kalukara, which was a smaller scale event, smaller by comparison to the Vada Kalukara, where about 5 to 8,000 Sikhs were killed over a period of several weeks or months. And this Shorta Kalukara happened in the 1740s. And the Shorta Kalukara was, and here's where the term genocide can be used appropriately. It was essentially a genocidal campaign. And the Vada Kalukara was more of a battle. It was the Afghani government in surrounding the Sikhs who were camped out um, in in a sort of rural area, in a jungle area of Punjab, and they became trapped by the Afghani army. And the Afghani army sort of surrounded them, and the Sikhs were not just warriors, it wasn't just fighters, it was also non combatants. So it was children, women who were not fighters, older people, and so on. And the warriors formed a circle around the non combatants and they tried to retreat away from the battle because the numbers were just too large on the Afghani side compared to the Sikhs. But the Afghanis broke in through this sort of circle that the Sikhs made and just came in and swept through all these non-combatants and just killed thousands of people. And it's considered to be the largest loss of life in a single day in Sikh history. And we don't know the exact numbers, of course, but the estimates are anywhere from 20 to 30, or maybe even some scholars say 40,000 people died in one day. So just a huge loss of life, just tremendous loss of life. And what's important about a Kalukara is that it encompasses a whole bunch of different ideas. It's a battle. There's warriors fighting, but it's also a massacre of non-combatants, of people who are not fighting or who can't fight. And it's also uh, so it's both a massacre and a battle, and I think that's an important distinction to make. And it includes those people who fought and those who were not able to fight as well. And so both of those groups are encompassed within that definition of Kalukara. And that's why I feel like it's such a powerful term and one that we need to sort of return to or start to use in the diaspora to talk about 84, because first of all, it's our own native term, and we can get to that in a little bit why that's important to use our own native terminology. But it's also that it allows for us to understand 1984 through a Sikh lens. And instead of using somebody else's framework, using our own framework. And our own framework developed from our own history of struggle and oppression and resurgence and fighting back, because that's what a kalukara also encompasses within it. You're not just a passive victim in a kalukara, you're also fighting back. There are also members of the community who are fighting back against the oppressor. And that's an important distinction to make. And that was sort of the problem that I found with the term Battle of Amritsar. Battle of Amritsar is an awesome term. It's really powerful. It 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 works really well, but when you talk about Battle of Amritsar, you're really centering the experience of, Sant Jarnail Singh and these other people under him who fought back in June of 84. But how about like those 10,000 Sikhs who had come to Harmandir Sahib for Guru Arjan Sahib's Shahidi Purab, right? How about those people who weren't fighters, who didn't have guns with them, who weren't fighting back against the Indian army during this attack? Where does their story fall? So if when we talk about genocide, we sort of erase the narrative of the fighters, and when we're talking about a battle, we sort of erase the narrative of these non-combatants. And what Kalukara allows us to talk about is talk about both those groups. And that's what I thought was really brilliant about the term, because it's a uniquely Sikh term that captures that idea of all the members of the community who underwent consequences as a result of these events.
And I think you already touched upon it in this, why is it important to use our own terms? And I think we've been unpacking that as we've been chatting, kind of why are words important? But maybe to summarize for folks, why is terminology, and particularly our own terms, why is it important to consider what terminology we're using? Yeah, and then also, I think you are also already touched on this a little, but why is it important for us? And then why is it also important in the bigger picture, maybe like for policymakers and governments? And how do words have real life consequences?
Yeah, words matter so much because they define our reality essentially, right? And when we're talking about something as traumatic of an experience as what happened in 84 and afterwards to the Six, if we look at other communities, this is actually a normal process that communities go through. They will come up with their own indigenous or native terminology for what happened. So when you talk about the Holocaust in Israel or amongst Jewish people, they don't call it the Holocaust, they call it the Shoah, and that's the term that they use. Or Palestinians, when they talk about what happened in 48, they don't talk about losing a battle or being sent away from their homes in Palestine. They talk about the Nakba, right? That this is a term that the Palestinians use, and it's a term that's become so ingrained that those of us who aren't Palestinian even know the term now as well, right? And similarly, for the Armenian genocide, there's also a term that the Armenians use that describes what happened to them. The Roma people, the Gypsies, they have their own term for what they experienced in the Holocaust. And different communities will come up with their own term to describe what happened to them using their own language, because language is so important. It's a connection to one's history and one's culture, and using a word from a colonizer's language, essentially, which is what English is, to describe something as intimate as what happened to us in 84 really is troubling. And being able to use our own term um, allows us to take ownership of what happened in 84 in a very emotional way. It allows us to understand what happened. But it also allows, and I mentioned this in the essay, it allows for different ideas to enter into the discussion that are difficult when we're talking about Operation Blue Star or genocide. And these are Sikh terms like Pana or Hukum. You know, we talk about everything happening in Pana, everything that happens, we have to accept it as Hukum. And that's hard to do when you're talking about a genocide. But when you're talking about a Kalukada, you can say, oh, the Sikhs of the 18th century, they experienced these horrors, but they also understood it was within the Hukam of Vaheguru, and they were able to heal and move on as a community, and also push back as a community, as a united community. And Sikhs post 84, have we been able to do that? Not as much in some ways. In some ways, we have as well. There was an armed struggle against the Indian government that I don't want to erase as well. Post 84, of course, as well. And that there was an ongoing sangharsh, an ongoing struggle against the Indian government. But what when we use the term that is native to our own mother tongue, we're able to understand that experience in a way that's not filtered through the lens of an outsider's language. And that I think is really powerful and important. It's as simple as when you're going undergoing therapy, for example, you don't want to be told this happened to you, this happened to you. The therapist doesn't sit there and list out all the horrible things that happened to you. You experience or you re-experience the trauma that you felt, and you explain it in your own words to your therapist. Your therapist doesn't tell you what to say. Use your own language to describe your experience. In the same way, that's what the community needs to do as well, is describe what happened to us in our own language, through our own terminology. I know that's ironic considering that we're speaking in English right now, and English is for most of us the first language that we learned growing up, and it's the language that we use day to day. But when it comes to important terms, I think that it's important to still use those Punjabi or those Sikh terminology, and to hold on to that part of our culture.
And I think you mentioned it in the article, and maybe you already mentioned it in our chat today. But I think using the term Kalugara for 1984 also like harkens back to like the first Kalugara, the Shota Kalugara, the Badda Kalugara. So not only are you invoking 1984, but you're also invoking Sikh history. So I think, yeah, that creates, yeah, that's like an important through line or important like collective narrative that gets remembered when you use
Yeah,
a
I
term
mean,
like
that's what
Kalugara.
we do in our das every day, essentially, is a part of that, right? We remember the shaheeds of the past, and we bring them into our living memory as a community, as a band. And that's what we can do when we use terms like Kalugara. We're taking the experience of what Sikhs went through in the 18th century and the experience of what Sikhs went through in the 20th century, and showing the connection between them, and creating that narrative through line between what Sikhs experienced in the past and the present, and really creating a sense of community that goes past constraints of time and era, and to something much bigger, more deeply meaningful. Yeah.
Definitely. I really enjoyed what you shared about the like how it invokes healing, how it invokes moving on, but it also invokes like pushing back, which I think I'm always like I always feel a little bit unsettled with like the moving on part, just because of like everything else that comes with it, because it feels like a forgetting. But that's not
Yes.
what you're saying at all. It's a push back. And I think,
Yeah, it's a
yeah.
push to action, actually, right? It's a
Mhm.
call to action. And that's the really beautiful thing, is that you can move on without forgetting the past. And Sikhs really don't forget the past. That's what we do again in our das every day. We remember all the shaheeds of the past, right? And so at the same time, um, it's to use the experience of the past as strength to push forward, instead of something that weighs us down and stops us from being an active participant in the world, you know? And that's really what the Guru Sahibs wanted for us, was to be active participants in the world, to make a change, to push, to bring that vision of Ikwan God into the world in every aspect of our society that we're engaged in. And that's what can happen when we start using the terminology. And I know that just starting to use the term Kalukara is going to make a massive change overnight. I think it's part of a larger process of starting to think about the events of 1984, June and November of 1984, from a Sikh perspective. And instead of worrying, I think, and we've done this for a long time, I know in the diaspora, we've done this for a long time, worried about validation from outsiders, from the media, from governments, from lawyers, from courts. Instead, saying, no, this is what we experienced, and we don't need to actually have it validated by any of you on the outside. This is something that we experienced as a community, and this is how we understand it, and this is how it's going to push us to move forward in the future. And I think that's the powerful idea behind using our own terminology, because we don't need to, frankly, seek validation anymore. We don't need to frame things in the language of the colonizer anymore. We can frame things in our own terminology. Yeah.
Hmm. And I think, yeah, kind of the terminology that's getting invoked now, like validation, yeah, maybe even sick lens or strengths based, which is a term you use in the article that you're, yeah, trying to use a strengths-based lens. I know strength-based from my social work practice, and I know it's like I understand it as a shift in narrative where someone is sharing their story and you want them to retell their story in a strengths-based way.
Yes.
So it's for a person or community to focus on the strengths and their self-determination, to highlight like how resourceful they are, how resilient they are, as opposed to focusing on the opposite or like kind of a fear-based approach. So I'm wondering, was this framing purposeful, and why did you choose this framing? Yeah, and was it purposeful?
Yeah, it was purposeful, and that's exactly what I was trying to do. I was trying to turn away from a deficits-based approach, right? And when I use the term strength-based, what I was trying to say was, um, as a community, we are trying to move forward and take ownership of what happened in '84. And every step along that has been positive, whether it's pogroms or genocide or Battle of Amritsar. All of these are strengths-based approaches because they take something that happened to us as a community that was really traumatizing, and look at the strengths that the community has and reframes those events in a way that really pushes those strengths of the community forward. And that's what I was trying to get at. At the same time, um, I think what I was trying to say when I use the term strength based in the article is that um, we're not coming at this from a place of lack. We're not coming at this from a place of that this is what's wrong with what we've been doing, that you're wrong for saying this term, you're wrong for doing this term. I didn't want this to become a sort of um, me putting down people for the language that they're using. And I don't think that that's what we need to be doing. We don't need to be policing each other's language either. If people want to continue to use the word genocide, for example, or if people want to continue to use the word pogroms, that's totally fine as well. This was just my own personal idea of, as a community, I feel like this is a way that we can move forward and heal and really bring together a sense of unity, a purpose in our experience in a way that Sikhs used to have in the 18th century and that we can have again today.
Yeah, and it does seem like a way to also unify like diaspora and folks in the homeland. Because as you shared at the beginning, Galugara is already like in popular use in Punjab. So yeah, kind of having a unified narrative globally. And that, yeah, does bring me to my last question. In conversations that I've had with, yeah, Sikhs in the diaspora, with other folks, there's always this idea of the importance of a unified narrative, that we all kind of have to like get our stories straight and agree on what happened. Um, so yeah, I'm wondering, yeah, what you think about a unified narrative. What's the purpose of it? Why is it important? Yeah, any thoughts that you have on that?
Yeah, I think a unified narrative is important because it allows one to build a sense of solidarity within the community, that we can say this is what happened to us. I've got an article coming out in a couple of months where I'll be talking about explaining sort of why Sant Jarnail Singh was in the Harmandir Sahib complex during 84, for example. And, there's a lot of criticisms from members of the community still of why was he there? What was he doing there? And when we have that sort of modeled, like some people are criticizing what happened, we're not all on the same page, then there's a lack of unity of purpose. I'm not saying everyone has to think exactly alike. I'm not saying everyone has to understand or process what happened in 84 in the same way. And I'm not saying that we all have to parrot the exact same language or the same phrases either. What I'm trying to say is that if we have a general framework for this is what happened in 84, that this is what the government did, this is how Sikhs responded, this is how Sikhs have been responding, and this is how Sikhs will continue to respond, then that creates something that our community can build upon. And that allows us to also talk about these issues in a way that really gets us away from arguing about semantics, gets us away from arguing about too many details, and allows us instead to talk about sort of the bigger picture. One thing that we haven't done as a community in a large scale way is talk about why 84 happened, for example, you know, because we've been spending so much time over the last 40 years talking about what happened in 84, how we experienced it. If one was to ask, a sort of a random young Punjabi teenager, what happened in 84, they might know about the attack on Harmandir Sahib, they might know about what happened in November. But if you were to ask them why it happened, people would be at a loss to explain why it happened. And I think that's sort of demonstrating that lack of a narrative that we have as a community, that lack of a sort of uh, um, shared understanding that we haven't been able to answer those types of questions. We haven't been able to really understand, oh, this is why this happened. This is part of a longer term process that the Indian government was engaging in. This is a process that's still going on that we see in modern India as well. And this is how Sikhs need to respond to this. And this is how Sikhs should be maybe responding to it. And once we start having those types of conversations, I feel like we can really get to a place of much more strength and a place of much more positive action as a community. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Santbir Singh. I'm wondering if there's anything else you want to share as we kind of wrap up our conversation, anything maybe that we miss?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered most of the major ideas. I'm really curious for people to read the article and really give us your feedback as to what you think about these ideas. I'm not expecting that everyone's going to agree with me. And again, I do want to reiterate that this isn't me criticizing the language that the community is using, but just talking about how maybe as a community we can move forward together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found it more as like starting a conversation, being in dialogue with each other, as opposed to saying, that's wrong, this is correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I kind of engaged with the article. Well, yeah, okay. Yeah, just to conclude our conversation, thank you so much for, yeah, kind of walking us through your thought process, yeah, the history of the terms that we've used to describe the events in 1984. Yeah, and just joining me in conversation today. If folks are interested in delving like deeper into the article or being in conversation with Santbir Singh, they can read the whole article at sikri.org. Yeah, thank you again, everyone, for joining me. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa.
Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
You were listening to Sikhcast by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.